Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Hanson Search and 3Pipe webinar this morning. My name is Jim. I'm one of the co-founders of 3Pipe Reply. I'm a last-minute stand-in for Alice, so I'm sorry if you were expecting her this morning. This morning, we're going to be running through a really great topic of conversation, which is all about the role of organic social within an organisation, how that role might have changed during the pandemic, and also how best it can integrate with paid social and wider performance marketing channels. We have a great panel this morning. Two of my colleagues, George, who heads up Organic Social, and Daisy, who's a Senior Account Director in our paid media team, will be running through a deck with you, a very short presentation. Before we move on to a Q&A with a couple of great panelists, we have Andrew Marcus, who's the head of PR at the Museum of London, and we have Daisy Hawker-Wallace, who's Deputy Director and Head of PR at Avanti West Coast Trains. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, George and Daisy, take you through a deck. Just one thing to sort of mention, if you've got any questions that come up while you're listening to the deck, please do use the Q&A function of the webinar, and we'll do our best to come to those questions at the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Jim. So hi everyone, my name's George. I'm the Organic Social Lead at 3Pipe Reply, working in the PR and social team. I've been doing social content in one form or another for the best part of a decade, probably a bit more than that now. I'm not counting exactly. And I've worked across a number of specialisms, so from media agencies to creative agencies to pure play agencies, and now make my home at 3Pipe Reply. And we're a brand performance agency. I'm going to hand over to Daisy to introduce herself in the paid media team.
Hi everyone, I am Daisy. I have been at 3Pipe for 7 years, and I specialise in brand performance media, and particularly in retail. So I've worked with a number of fashion, beauty and homeware brands over the years, such as Sweaty Betty, Elemis, Cowshed, Soho Home, to name just a few.
Brilliant, cool, thank you, Daisy. So the topic of our talk today is what next for organic social, evaluating the role and outlook for organic versus paid content and the communities that are built around social channels. I think the natural sort of question for me is kind of why evaluate this now over any other time. And I think there's kind of three things that we think are important and kind of reason for doing that. So the first is around shifting consumer expectations and trends that we've seen in the market. And I think some of those have quite a large impact for how brands sort of use content, and particularly use organic content in the market. The second is around evolving consumer demographics. So that's never not really the case. You know, consumer demographics do continually shift over time, but I think there have been some sort of tentpole moments in the last year or so that I think actually give us pause to really think and sort of take to stop and reevaluate what we're doing. And the last one really, and this is actually based around conversations that we've had internally and with agency partners and with clients, and that's around efficiencies that we can unlock by bringing performance and organic teams closer together. And we'll take you through some examples of where those efficiencies can lie. And then at the end of the deck, we'll give you a sort of a takeaway of sorts as a checklist for you to go away and sort of have a look at your own organic channels and have an assessment of your own. I'm going to hand over to Daisy now to take you through some of the stats.
So what has changed? Well, product discovery really is just the first step. With 79% of people searching for more information after having seen a product or service on Instagram, brands really need to ensure that their content and values align across their website, social media, paid ads, email, and all other platforms. Consumers will do their own research, and if they feel like there is a disconnect between the brand's content when discovering new products, it can really reduce the trust in the brand from the outset. We've really seen the role of social channels shifting from more of a discovery to a confirmation and social proof. So 80% of consumers are using Instagram to make a decision whether to purchase, and 20% of consumers will check a brand's social media channels before making their first purchase. So that your social media content can really help consumers determine the service characteristics of your brand, how you support your communities, your values. They will look at reviews, and this is all to help reduce the purchase risk. What also helps is what other people are saying about your brand on your channel, especially during COVID when consumers are unable to get that experience or try products in stores. They're really looking for that proof from others that have sampled your brand and what their opinions are.
Thanks, Daisy. I think the other thing that's quite important for me is that actually the way people are researching brands kind of differs across the different generations. So this is some really good research that came out of Global Web Index. They've got a commerce flagship report that I would recommend anyone go and have a look at. There's some really good stuff in there. But this for me was really important, really interesting, because actually when you look at Gen Z and millennials, they're at the top of the pile really in terms of percentage of users who will actually go away and use a social network to learn about a brand, product and service. And that's a really big chunk. But actually, when alluded to kind of demographic shifts earlier, when we consider that 2020 was the year that all global consumers, when we say all global consumers as a whole, actually Gen Z form 40% of that. They form a massive piece of the kind of the global population. So the fact that these guys are using social channels so prolifically to actually go and do that research is a real opportunity for us to kind of make sure those organic channels are doing the best they possibly can do. Now, obviously, boomers and Gen X are kind of lagging behind a little bit, but I wouldn't say those are insignificant numbers either. So in either way, regardless of whether you're targeting Gen Z all the way through to boomers, I think making sure your organic channels are performing well is really important. And you might sort of say, why organic channels? Why not just make all your channels work really well? And obviously, you should be looking to do that. But I think when we zoom out a little bit and just look at brand research as a whole, in terms of where people will go to do that, the top spot really, and this is not unexpected, I think, is that 51% of people will go to a brand website to do that research. I think for the past decade plus, the owned property and in your website has been the best place for you to go and actually control the narrative, be very specific about how you sort of frame your product, your services, and what you do. And I think that will continue. But actually, when you look at the second slot, and in the second spot here, 44% of the people will then go to or will use a brand's social channels to do that research as well. So I think if we're not thinking about organic channels as being some form of landing page, a place where you can tell that brand narrative and reinforce what you're doing on a website, I think that's something that we really need to be thinking about moving forward. And also we talked about kind of shifting attitudes around like what consumers are looking for from brands. And you'd expect things like, good products that don't break, customer service that does what it says it should do. But I think there's an element here of people expect that now, that it's not really something they're looking for explicitly out of brands. But what they are starting to look for is a bit more nuanced and a bit more sort of below the surface. So people are looking for brands to be eco-friendly, for example. They're looking for proof that they're looking after the planet and helping us move towards a more sustainable future. They're looking for brands that are actually listening to customer feedback. And this isn't just customer service, it's also around the feedback that people are getting from people are giving from the products that they're using. And they're also looking for brands to be socially responsible as well. So I think there's a lot more that brands need to be showing in the communications that are kind of running across social channels that arguably hasn't been necessarily needed before. And it would be remiss of us not to mention COVID at this point, but I won't labor the point here. I think the most interesting thing for me really is that actually, again, we've had conversations where people have said, oh, well, COVID is just a temporary thing. When we're through it, then it'll all be gone back to normal. And I reckon, a lot of it will do. And God knows I would love to be able to go to a pub garden and have a pint right now. And, I think we all want to get back to that kind of old normal in some way, shape or form. But to say that this effect on kind of online retail and people buying and accessing products online isn't around to stay, I think is disingenuous. And certainly some of the research here does show that there's an increasing trend of people to think about shopping online more frequently in the future, regardless of whether COVID is around. Now, sorry, I shouldn't have started yet. I will start it now. With the research done, so with all the kind of the stats up there, we're going to kind of look at some of the efficiencies that we can see in the opportunities that we can get there, or some of the inefficiencies that exist in legacy systems. So if we think about content first, we often see silo production between performance paid performance and paid teams and organic teams in terms of how that content is produced and generated. And I've got a very oversimplified diagram here of what some of that, what that can sometimes look like. And this is effectively, a client will sort of have, like, they need content for their performance arm, they need content for their organic stuff, and they'll also sometimes go away and brief 2 different agencies to go and create different content. Those briefs will get to 2 different studios, will produce 2 different sets of assets. And actually, when we think about those 2 different sets of assets and how they actually end up with the end consumer, there can be a real disconnect there, right? Because you've got 2 different studios working on different files, they've got a different look and feel. The optimizations for a piece of performance creative versus a piece of organic creative are very different. And actually, with the end consumer, if you're doing things right and you've got your kind of performance on, putting in new consumers, and they kind of then go and do their research into you and your brand, that can be quite a disconnect. They see a very different piece of performance creative. They go and look at your social channels and they see a very different piece of organic creative. And actually, there's a real efficiency here to, if you unlock it by briefing your organic and your performance creative through the same studio, you get the same look and feel. There isn't a disconnect for the consumer. And you also don't end up duplicating on sort of resources that are going into these 2 different content forms. I'm going to hand over to Daisy now to talk around some of the overlaps and the differences between organic and paid and how we see that.
Thanks, George. So as George just explained, paid and organic social are often siloed into separate teams that don't often collaborate with each other and therefore can have completely different messages across both. So generally the focus of organic social is to build and maintain your online presence, posting regular valuable content, interacting with your audience, and just helping you create that engaged community of fans that can be nurtured into loyal customers. Whereas on paid social, we can build bespoke advertising campaigns to reach larger, more targeted audiences at the right time. However, when you bring those together and align them, you can then do re-engage people who have engaged with your organic content, because those people have shown some interest or intent. So you want to re-engage them and show them more about what your product or your service. You can also reinforce your values on paid social that you talk about in your organic content. That will really make you stand out from your competitors. And then combining both of them together, you can get a much broader audience and really grow your online presence. And the key one for me is testing the content across both to create those efficiencies. We work with Mojave Slipper brand, where we've done a lot of that testing across organic and social, and what content works between each one. We had a video of Mojave's of how they create their product in their factory, and we tested that over on paid, and it didn't perform as well, but we kind of got some great learnings in terms of what the video length should be, and what also organic people that go to your organic channels want to see. And so we've proposed a top line approach to minimising that overlap and the inefficiencies between organic and paid social, and to increase that insight sharing across both functions. So usually the main objective for your performance or paid media is based on a conversion goal, whether that be website traffic, purchase, and lead generation. However, for organic, it tends to be more around the post engagement and building your follower growth in order to engage your customers. However, working together, custom audiences can be built based on the data that you collect from your organic. So your follower growth can result in increased reach for those lookalike or re-engagement campaigns over on your paid channels. And in terms of the content, the product imagery, the clear call to actions tend to work better on paid media versus the lifestyle, the values, influencer content on organic. However, like I said, testing across those functions and aligning your values can create those efficiencies.
Brilliant. Thanks, Daisy. So I think now is probably a good time to kind of have a look at what we think makes a good organic presence as we kind of wrap up where we've kind of been to. And I think the first thing for me is to have a really good handle on your objectives and minimize that overlap and that wastage wherever you possibly can do. So to Daisy's point just there, making sure that you're not both doing the same objective, and you're making sure you're not both using the same audiences at the same time, is a really good way to make sure that your organic is actually doing the best job it can do for you. The second, and this is quite key for me, and that's designed for the perfect customer and not for the perfect customer experience. And I think sometimes as marketers, we kind of think that we can control the narrative in a very specific way. We can stop someone seeing a certain message at a certain point and really drive that sequential messaging. And yes, arguably you can do that sometimes, but there's a lot of effort that goes into it, and arguably not the best returns in terms of actually driving that in a consistent way. I think one example that sticks out for me, and I don't know if many people have seen this in recent months, was there was a VOD campaign done with Doritos where there's a guy sitting on a couch playing a video game with some zombies in it, and the zombie obviously has a thing for Doritos. He reaches out of the TV and he starts eating the Doritos. There's a few extra videos that kind of go after that, and it's just them sitting on the sofa playing games. The thing there is that actually I saw the third or fourth video before I saw the first video, and that was really confusing for me because I didn't have any idea what this was about. It was just a zombie sitting next to a guy eating some Doritos. And I think when we try and control that narrative so carefully, that doesn't really work. So making sure we're kind of designing that content for the customer and not actually just really controlling the precise order of things that they're seeing. Mimic and shadow performance campaigns wherever this is feasible, and use the paid insights that can come back from it. So the Mojave's example that Daisy just used is a good one. We see the same thing happening with Halo Sleep, who's another one of the brands that we're working with at the moment. And we're working both across paid and organic, showing those insights between them. And actually this mimicking or the shadowing of the performance campaigns is also really important. It's trying to draw that red thread through what you're doing in performance through to organic. And it doesn't have to be that explicit. Let's say, for example, you're running a product campaign or a specific product in performance. You don't have to necessarily have that same creative in your organic presence, but you can change your banners and you can change your hero creative so that if someone does then go and do the due diligence and do their research, they're seeing a consistent theme and a consistent message. I think that's really powerful. Give credence to the community and treat the community as important. Unfortunately, we still see so many brands who have kind of built up these audiences over time, and they still sort of use social channels as a broadcast medium. And if that's kind of what your organic setup is set up to do, then arguably it's not the best way of using it. The community have kind of come along with you on the journey, and to give them things like kickbacks and kind of actively show you're listening to them is a really good way and a really strong way of making sure they kind of stick with you. Reinforce your values for existing customers. So let's say you've got people on board, they like your products, but as we've seen earlier on, some people are starting to look for different things from the brands that they buy from. Making sure those values, if you've got sustainability values that you can use and bring them to light in an authentic way, absolutely brilliant idea to do that. If you could show you're being eco-sensitive, as well, that's a good way of doing it. And making sure that existing customers have a reason to stick around and to kind of continue to be a user of your products. And then service customers where they expect to be reached. This in its own could be an entire webinar. We're not going to go into detail here. But again, if you're going to offer customer service on a social channel, make sure that you can offer like 80% to 90% of that customer service on the channel. Again, we're seeing time and time again, brands will sort of try and take it offline immediately or very soon after a customer service issue has been brought to light, asking them to pick up a phone or jump into an email. It's just a really bad experience for the customer. And again, these Gen X, people have come through, sorry, Gen Zs, the people who now represent such a big population, they're expecting this to be handled offline and not sort of on a phone. So ensure that you can be able to do that. And to summarize that really all, and to kind of give you guys something to take away, a bit of a checklist for you to kind of go and have a look at your own organic channels with. So the first is to audit your infrastructure for signposting, information, messaging, and creative. And this is just effectively to go to all your channels, ideally not in the logged in state. Look at what your channels look like. Is the information right? Have you got the right links? Is there anything that's out of date? Does the creative and the messaging kind of fit with the kind of the level of production quality that you want the brand to have? Have a kind of a view on that. The second is to step into the customer and take an objective view on your content in terms of what's right, what's wrong, and what's missing. And I literally mean try and remove yourself from your body and put yourself into the mind of a consumer. If you've got personas, it's a great way of kind of framing that. And it gives you a really good opportunity to actually have a real sort of look at it with fresh eyes and say, is this actually doing the job that we need it to be doing for the people that we're trying to reach? Check your audience targeting overlap with performance and mitigate against it, whether that's kind of making sure your performance and your organic teams sort of are more closely linked, or whether it's just asking the question. We don't want to see people the organic or paid cannibalizing each other in terms of targeting, and just make sure that doesn't happen. Assess responsiveness to customer care and consumer interactions, and by that I mean both the customer service element, but also how you actually speak to your consumers and your audience that you've built up. Social was built around conversations and people interacting with each other online. And if you're not interacting with your customers, then set yourself a target and start to try and do that. And you'll see actually people start to really pay attention a lot more. And the same thing with customer care. If you're offering customer service online, but you're falling outside of a 24-hour window of sort of addressing it, then ideally things need to be tightened up there a bit. And then review for expired, irrelevant, time-sensitive content and remove it. So if you put yourself in the position of a new customer who's come to your channel and they see an old price promotion and think, oh, this is brilliant, I can get the product at a reduced price, but then they find out that's expired, that's a really bad experience as well. So just make sure the things that are old and no longer relevant are taken away so that people can't actually surface them. And lastly, and this is probably a smaller thing really, but we do work with some brands who have sunset channels. Let's say Twitter, for example, has fallen out of love. Lots of people have fallen out of love with Twitter, for various right and wrong reasons. But if you have sunset a channel, make sure that the signposting on that channel is up to date. It's terrible if you've got a sunset channel and things are moved on for the channels you actively manage, because someone could end up there, click a link and end up somewhere that doesn't exist. Again, it's just a really bad way of kind of dealing with those customers. And we just want to make sure that everything is as seamless as possible for anyone that kind of comes to your channels. So I hope that's all been sort of helpful and made sense. That concludes the presentation, and I'll hand back to Jim to jump into the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Daisy. Lots to think about there. I think what we're going to do now is just go to a couple of our guest panelists, Andrew and Daisy, and just get their initial thoughts and observations on some of that content, and then we'll try into some further questions. So, Andrew, what do you think about what you've heard this morning?
Hi. Yeah, really fascinating. I was making some notes as we went through, and I think the thing that really stood out for me was Daisy's point about alignment between the brand. I think you used the word values a lot, which is great, and the content you see on social. So often you see there is one of my competitors, I won't name names, has a great reputation for a really kooky approach to Twitter. But that is so disjointed from the experience of the brand in every other way. So yeah, that really resonated with me, that point about alignment.
Daisy?
The other Daisy, hi. Yeah, I made some notes too, Andrew. I mean, I'd echo that as well. I think we are Avanti West Coast, but formerly Virgin Trains, and I won't bore you with rail franchising, but basically we all 2P'd across to a new business, and we were launching that business right as COVID hit. So that's been a really odd experience, but and a very challenging one, because a lot of people still don't know who we are. We're just the train with the orange triangle that used to be Virgin. And we're working very hard on that. And I've been working very closely with the brand team on our values. I mean, in many ways, this pandemic has given us a bit of time to pause and reflect about who the brand is, what we stand for, what our values are. And it's sort of happened concurrently with a time where consumers really care about brand values and what you stand for as a business. And the work that we've been doing in the last year, we launched a train. It's called the Pride Train, and it has the full livery is wrapped with the LGBTQ plus flag. And we worked really hard on that campaign, and it's gone down really well internally as well as externally. But what's interesting is that we do have a really critical sort of fan base. It's people that have followed us from the last train company, from Virgin, and they've come across with us to Avanti. But obviously we're trying to grow that follower base. But what was interesting is that it's a very vocal faction of society. And we had come out with some statements about how the business is going to be very inclusive and focuses on diversity and inclusion, which is all true. But one of them noticed that on our drop-down menu on our website, we didn't have, it was all Mr. Mrs. There was no, I'm going to say the wrong thing, but there was no non-binary or, the right things that it should have said. And it came up through our social channels and it was flagged to me. And I went straight to the team. I said, we have to fix this now. This isn't right. We can't be an inclusive business if we're not going to reflect it on every channel. And we did fix it. And actually that faction were overjoyed and really pleased and really happy that we're interacting and listening to them. And I think, we're all human, we make mistakes, but we're all learning. But I think to have that accountability and to have that focus on people and our consumers and show that you care, it is so important. And in the deck, it talks about, your e-credentials, your focus on sustainability. And we talk about that an awful lot in our business as well.
I think that's a really important point in terms of that consistency of content or approach across all the different touch points, and well illustrated in that example. I'm gonna come into some more specific questions that we've created. And again, anyone who's watching, please use the Q&A function. I've already seen one question which hopefully my colleague is going to answer in a moment. I'm going to start with you, Daisy. I guess the word organic sometimes assumes or gives the impression that it's free, but we know that isn't the case, right? Should we be calling it something else? And what are some of the costs that go into that organic or free approach?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Thanks for asking me, because I'm quite passionate about it. I mean, I've been here 6 years now, and my team often still get called the organic team, the free team, and people assume that what we do is easy and free. And it's a real bone of contention. And I correct people time and time again. I say, look, what we do is not free, and we are not, we're not just organic, because I don't really believe that organic exists anymore. I mean, I think that's quite an old set of rules, an old set of terminology, and I think we've moved on from that. But obviously, things move very fast in social, and people are still catching up, especially if you're not in the industry. We call it editorial social. My team has full control editorially of our channels. We do work very closely with the paid team, but I'm sure we'll get to this in another question. We are separate teams and there is a conflict there. We have a very small budget relative to the paid team who they put tons of money behind what they do, but we boost for engagement. So if we see something's going well, we'll put a bit behind it, and that's our approach. And it always has been. And unless there's a campaign involved and it's a very specific piece of work we're doing where we set aside budget, it's a test and learn for us. But there is a very small drip feed of boosting budget. But going back to the point of if it's free or not, well, it's never free, because it's on people's time. So you're paying for the specialists within the team, or whether you employ an agency, so there potentially is an agency and cost involved if we're producing content, but nothing's free. If you're still you might be photoshopping an image, or you might be going out and getting some video, that's all time, so that's all money. So it's so very rare that something gets given to you centrally from the business and you think, great, that's going to work for our channels. Often it's too corporate, it's too polished, it's not rough and ready enough for that audience, or it's not authentic enough, it doesn't feel human enough. So we would want to go and adapt it and make it personalized, and that's time, and time is money.
Is that a similar feeling? I know you've got obviously some great content that you can showcase. I mean, is it a similar sort of perception internally?
Yeah, yes and no, it's slightly different. So for context, at the Museum of London, I oversee PR, marketing, brand, social, CRM, and some other bits and bobs, and latterly digital transformation. And there's about 12 of us. So integration is kind of second nature. And I think this, we don't have this discussion anymore. As Daisy said, we don't use terms like organic, because we just talk about things like, so we, like a Museum of London, real bricks and mortar business, COVID hit, shut down. One of our brand behaviors is the doors stay open. We mean that metaphorically, but actually we could deliver that literally online last summer. And so if you take, for example, Great Fire of London, really important stream of content for us. It's like a real hero. So we just said, how are we going to surface this? The team swarmed around it. Absolutely, as Daisy said, the amount of investment in terms of people's time is really important and shouldn't be forgotten. Nothing is free. But there were people behind creating editorial content, boosting it, paid promotion, let alone the kind of curatorial experts. And yeah, as I say, we have an advantage because we're small and quite nimble, but everyone can work together around a particular objective.
Okay, great. George, I'm going to come on to a question for you about channel choice, because it just seems there's so much. And, you know, even over the last 12 months when everyone was on House Party and what happened to House Party, and now it's Clubhouse, where do brands start trying to navigate their investment or time they should be spending in each of these channels that seems to present an opportunity for engagement?
That is, yeah, that's a good question. I think it's not a simple answer, as is often the case with this stuff. I think part of the answer actually depends on your brand's attitude to kind of how often you want to test and learn things, and actually how much resource do you have available to kind of get involved with those things. Both Daisy and Andrew mentioned, you know, that people's time is ultimately the main cost factor in a lot of this stuff, and to jump into some of these channels and do them properly is actually quite a time investment, especially if they're new, because no one really knows how to use them yet and everyone has to learn, right? So, I mean, I personally take quite a sort of a weighting approach to some of these things. And I think it's sometimes better for a brand to kind of watch other brands and see what they do and learn from their successes and their mistakes before they kind of start rolling into it. I also think that things like TikTok, for example, which is very much a youth platform, and you know, it comes with a pretty long line of things you need to learn to actually do it properly. I think one of the best ways of getting into TikTok is to go through influencers, and that's always going to be a really good way of accessing some of those channels, because influencers, by their very right or by their very nature, understand these much better than someone in a content team will be able to. There's not to say they can't catch up, but at least from the beginning, those guys are definitely going to know those platforms sort of inside out more quickly than you will be able to. And I think those learnings that you can get from other brands will always help you sort of work out where you need to put the focus in terms of resources to do them properly. But I think that the last thing I would say is that actually, for me, consistency is really key in what people do in what brands do with social channels. So it's all well and good if you do have the resources to jump in and test things, but I think don't lose the consistency and approach for the channels that you've kind of set up and can trust over time, because those are the communities that you've built up and have sort of loyalty with, and to kind of just go after the new shiny thing every time that comes along can almost be a bit of a way of kind of losing touch with those audiences you've already got.
I'll just quickly, George, Daisy and Andrew, I mean, do you feel the temptation or the pressure to sort of do some more innovative work on more exciting channels than the usual sort of hygiene channels, let's call them?
I'll go first. Yeah, massive temptation. I think exactly as you said, George, there's so much out there, but it's all about test and learn. But actually that experimenting takes a lot of time and energy from the team, and then they're not focusing on the core channel. So I've got my team constantly saying, can we try this? Can we do this? We want to do this one. And I said, well, okay, as long as you can do your day-to-day work, can you get it all done? Because if I could get another couple of people, then we could be playing all the time. And if I had a bit more budget, then we could be playing all the time. But you know, we are quite a traditional brand, and I've got to look at the sort of commercial, you know, the commercial needs of the business. And, you know, we'd love to play on TikTok, and Ryanair are having a go at it as another travel brand in the space. But for us, you know, we don't have the resource to do it day in, day out. So maybe it's something that we look at for a campaign, and on a campaign by campaign basis. If I work somewhere else and it was maybe a more progressive brand and everything that they did was about early adoption, then absolutely we would embrace it. But it is actually really time consuming. But it doesn't mean that we don't want to do it.
I'm going to answer this a slightly different way. So if we're looking at how to prioritize, for me, it's about where the audience are and what they're using. And I think a lot of people will be surprised to hear how much I spend on market research at the Museum of London. And so I'm going to be honest, the research is probably a bit out of date because it's pre-COVID and everyone's consumer behavior changed radically. But we focus on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram because that's where our target visitors are. Now, we did some really, really, really wonderful experimentation on TikTok last year, and that's great, but the research tells me, well, I know precisely who we're targeting to bring through the doors of the Museum of London. And again, we're a bricks and mortar business. I know what channels they use, and that is where I would expect my team to invest most of their time. Now, when we refresh that research, say for example, it says that the segment we call self-developers, who are kind of trad museum goers, if they're all using TikTok, great, I would reallocate some resource that way. But at the moment, the decision's quite easy for me because it's research based.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's start with quite an interesting question around organic reach. I mean, we talked about organic reach just now, but some platforms have a better reach than others. George, I mean, there's a lot of talk about LinkedIn still has a decent organic reach versus other platforms. How important is that? I mean, clearly it's important, but how important is that in your planning for a lot of the clients that we're working with?
So, yeah, I think to echo actually what Daisy and Andrew mentioned earlier on about not using the word organic anymore. Although we're an organic content team, in some ways I've fallen out of love with the title. I actually really like the term editorial social. I think it speaks quite strongly to what we do. And yeah, you're right. Organic reach, you can get varying degrees of it. Yeah, LinkedIn has got some fairly good organic reach at the moment. Pinterest has actually got pretty good organic reach at the moment. And then you've got the kind of the ones which are pretty low, places like Facebook and Twitter. At least, in the channels that we run, we see the organic reach being pretty low on those channels. But actually, organic reach is already so low that if you're not running a paid sort of campaign or a paid sort of approach alongside it to kind of reach the audience that you need to reach, I mean, without sounding sensationalist, there's almost no point in doing it in the first place. And I say almost because there are some situations where that's not the case. But if you want to be reaching an audience and keeping a loyal audience going, organic and plus some sort of element of paid is the way of doing it. So organic reach is a bit of a misnomer, I think, in some regards. And we need to think about paid as being the sort of the engine behind the organic content stream. And I note that one of the questions from someone watching is actually around how valuable is the practice of boosting organic content in 2021, and should it be boosted when it's already live or published as promoted posts from the get-go, which I think is kind of the same question. And I would say that actually the practice of boosting organic content in this day and age is arguably something you can't avoid. And if you're going to run organic channels and you want to get something from them, and by that I mean if you want to be able to sort of display those values and help consumers make the decisions in those research phases, then you must be boosting content. You can sort of be selective with how you do that. You can wait for sort of certain pieces of content to go out, see how they do, and then chuck some money behind them, especially if you haven't got a massive budget to do that with. But my preferred way of doing it is to kind of give every piece of content a certain amount of spend, and then for the ones that do really well, to give them an extra boost on top of it, to kind of get it to the audiences you want to reach.
Bring the other Daisy now, because she hasn't said anything for a little while. So one of the things that we're challenged with as an agency is that high demand for content across both organic and performance channels, because the burn rate is so high, across especially like Facebook and Instagram. How are brands figuring out how to generate more content, but also quality content for both performance purposes, and how has behaviour changed or the approach changed to delivering that sort of content that we need?
The content used on organic and paid is different. The longevity of it is different. So something that you put on organic, you won't only be able to use once, whereas creative decay on paid is that much longer. So whilst I was talking about earlier, you can test and use content across both as much as possible. There are going to be instances where you some things are just going to be put on organic and some things just going to be pushed through paid, like campaigns or specific offers to specific audiences. One of the key things I think is using data. You'll have so much data that you collect yourself, and you can then figure out what is the speed or frequency that you need to kind of refresh your content. And that as well is through testing, just regular testing on both organic and paid media, to see when is the right time that you need to refresh that. What we've found works really well is we have a creative team in-house that we work closely with for both channels. And that means that we can, like I said earlier, align across them, produce content that is specific for social, and find out what works or what doesn't work.
Daisy and Andrew, I'll come to you first, Andrew. But obviously, you're both working in really interesting operation businesses where I imagine you can harvest content. I'm not going to say easily, but you've got that opportunity to grab as much as you need. How are you actually doing that?
So, I mean, firstly, George made a really important point that you can't really have organic / editorial without paid. Part of the pivot last March to online entailed an entirely new way of, as you say, harvesting that content. So a museum, loads and loads of content, a lot of it's online, a lot of it isn't. So we brought together about 20 what we call content heroes. They swarmed on a monthly basis, brainstormed content, and then people went away, created the content, brought it back together, coordinated by my then social media manager and PR manager, and it was planned into a schedule. And I think increasingly, the only option I think for my business is to decentralize the creation of content. I mean, I'm fortunate it's a content-y business, but decentralize the creation of content and support everybody to make amazing stuff that then gets populated in the schedule. And in reality, all the central team have to do is double check it's kind of on brand. But again, I'm lucky, I trust most of my colleagues to be creating stuff which comes from the foundations of where we want to be.
That's quite an interesting approach, Andrew. I'd like to steal it. We're in a slightly different position in that, the people that work at Avanti West Trains are actually key workers. They're running trains, and they have shift patterns, and it's customer first. So we sometimes struggle in asking our colleagues to capture content for us, because it's the shift first, and it's whatever takes priority in terms of getting people on board or keeping the trains running. Although we have looked at using our people more and more and more, and I think as we go back to full travel and things sort of get a little bit easier restriction wise, we are planning on rolling out a program where we hero the people in our business more, and we get them involved more, and that be more structured. We have done it, and there are some people within our business who are just really passionate and want to get involved with our team. They love what we do. They're just excited, and that's what's wonderful. And we've used those people and harnessed them, but to rely on them to capture content for us on the ground is a real struggle. And actually, we've often fallen down when we've tried to do that. So I'd say it's a mix for us. It's a mix of central brand assets, us going out on the network and capturing content ourselves, and also we work quite closely with the internal comms team. They capture a lot of content which has that authentic feel to it, and they're out and about shooting and creating, and a lot of that works really well for us on LinkedIn, for example. But the more we can use our frontline colleagues as brand ambassadors, that's where we're heading naturally. There's a lot of them, and it's an it's an extra, it's a nice to have, it's an ask, as opposed to being embedded in their day-to-day roles. It's also a heavily unionized business, so there's always that to take in into consideration, which does throw up a lot of issues for us. But yeah, heroing our people and getting brand ambassadors. We also work with a social content agency who produce a lot of content for us independently of what we shoot ourselves.
I've noticed a question from Hannah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you,
that.
you had a specific question there about how you've identified the content creators from your business, from the museum.
Yeah, I mean, it was really easy. We just said to, again, there's about 270 staff. The directive to pivot online came from the top, like absolutely from the top. So just said to every head of department, send 2 people to this meeting, they're going to become content heroes, reallocate their time. So, I mean, it was a blunt instrument, but it worked. And again, we were closed. We've got everyone at the Museum of London is really passionate about talking about London. There's no visitors to talk to. Online, it became an amazing way of doing that. So everyone was really into it. I think where I have to be really honest is, looking back, we lack the editorial guidelines and standards that would have helped. So in terms of that, like, second part of the question of like what good looked like, was fortunate all the content was good, and my PR manager and my social media manager vetted everything before it went online. But actually, for us, the next step is to codify what good looks like for us. And that ranges from historical accuracy through to the representation of London now, through to all the stuff you might expect, like, are we happy to have people shooting stuff on their iPhone, or is it professionally shot? Like, what works for our brand? Where does our logo appear? How do we talk about years? Lots of use of language. So I think it's a big task that we need to do next to tidy up a bit.
It sounds like your decentralized approach is being used in other organisations as well. Harry from Royal Parks does exactly the same. Well, I don't know who he copied his from, but it seems to be something that's working for other organisations too. With Andrew and Daisy, just quick chat about ownership of channels internally, and that sort of challenge, I guess, between that sort of brand marketing versus comms team, or PR team, or social team, wherever it sits. How do you navigate that? What's the agreement, I guess, internally within your organisations about ownership of the channels and how they're used and how it's managed? Start with Daisy.
Well, do we integrate? How is it managed? We are quite a traditional business still, and I think it's an evolving piece. I think in the time I've been here, I came in and said I wanted to do integrated work, and the business didn't know what that meant. So I've spent a huge amount of my time effectively educating internally that, you know, PR and social content are not sort of poor cousin to marketing and those channels. And unfortunately, there is still that hangover, and there is still that, you know, that ego battle. It does exist. And ultimately, the dream would for it to be merged and for it to be central, but the business isn't ready for that, and maybe it will never happen. But there is an agreement within our separate teams that we will do our best to work together, and we work really hard at that, to build those relationships and to share what we're each doing. We have regular check-ins, and there are conversations around, you know, whether things are on brand or not, or how we can share assets, and always having a conversation about who's boosting when. So I think it's just a constant form of communication. We don't always get it right, and it does feel far from perfect. I mean, I don't know, I'd love to know which brands are doing it really well, because I just think it's the organizational structure of the business doesn't really allow for us to matrix beautifully and pull budget in the way that we really actually would like to. I saw, I think it was this week, that Airbnb have come out and they're talking about a full funnel approach, and that they're sort of getting rid of some of their marketing, and it's all going to be PR and social first. And I thought that was really interesting. I do think the pandemic has sort of shone a light on sort of the hard sort of media functions, press office functions, PR, internal comms. I think we're having a bit of a moment and a resurgence, and people are realizing when the shit hits the fan, they really need people like us to manage the reputation. And my team sit right in the corporate affairs team, which is the heart of reputation. We sit with the media team, we sit with internal comms, we sit with public affairs, because everything we're doing is about protecting and growing the brand. So my argument is that brand should come and sit with us. They want us to go and sit with them, but it is the way it is. We do our best to get on and play nicely together.
Is it very different?
I mean, it's very different as far as small. It just takes a bit of a negotiation. However, I think the challenge I have, which is not unrelated, and I think people can probably empathise with, is a week does not go past when someone in my business says, we want to set up our own channel. So, for example, the Museum of London operates a few B2B functions. So we have in normal times, a successful venue hire business. We have a shop. We do some specialist curatorial projects which target particular groups. And fending off I want my own channel is really difficult. So my kind of rule of thumb is, if you're targeting a different audience, then maybe. So for example, our B2B venue hire businesses makes total sense that they can have certain different channels, speaking to totally different people. However, the shop are just targeting a subset-ish of our main audience visitors. That needs to be integrated into our mainstream channels. And I'm surprised, in the entire time I've been at the Museum of London, this discussion hasn't gone away, and I suspect other organisations have it too. And frankly, who's got the time and the people to manage loads of social channels?
I've seen George nod there, because often when we meet a new company or take over channels, there's hidden ones that we just discover lying around, aren't there, George?
I was muted. Yeah, definitely. I think, and that's often quite surprising, or actually unsurprising, given that it's happened so much. But I didn't mention reference to it earlier on, but actually, when you look at the last decade in terms of social channels and how brands have activated them and switched them off and things like that, there was this massive surge where everyone was just jumping on absolutely everything, and not necessarily knowing what they were doing it for. I think, and that's not a criticism against them at all. I think it's more a reflection of the bubble effect, maybe, of everyone just wanted to get onto everything they possibly could do, and it was a bit of a wild west, really. And yeah, there's a lot of like latent channels which are just sitting there collecting dust from the old days, and I often think that's almost a poor brand experience and a worse brand experience than not having them in the first place. So if you're going to go and find a brand and you put their name into a search bar on whichever social network you're looking for, and you get a load of channels which are no longer active or worse, being run by a rogue marketeer somewhere who doesn't actually subscribe to the main operation, then that's just not very good. It's not a very good situation for the brand to be in. I know that actually one of the questions from Laurie Wood was around what do you mean by a sunset channel, and that's probably a good segue to just jump into it and say what we mean by sunset channels is when brands have done that thing at the beginning where they've jumped into every social channel and created lots of different profiles, but then there's probably the discussion of the thing, either it's a resource thing or a performance thing. They think actually we don't need those channels anymore, so maybe they switch one off, maybe they switch Twitter off because it's not delivering what they want it to do. So that's what we mean by a sunset channel. Now there's two ways of doing that. There's the way which is the right way, which is you say we're no longer running this channel anymore. If you want to reach us, go here. And then there's the other way, which is they just let it go quiet and nothing happens and there's no update and there's old content on there. So there's a few different approaches, but yeah, there's often a situation where lots of channels exist and you didn't know they were there to begin with.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ask for quick answers to this next question. I guess if budgets are tight and you have to make a decision about organic versus paid, is it a case of actually choosing between the two? Does it depend on the timescales in which you're sort of trying to deliver something? What do the panel think about making that choice between the two things if you haven't got the budget to do everything that you want to do. Oh, Daisy, sorry.
I do believe that having a good organic presence reduces the reliance on paid. However, if you're a startup, you have smaller budgets, the quickest and fastest way of increasing your presence is to pay. Other things like to go viral, Airbnb were really good. They did like a referral loop to gain points. But it also depends on how good your product is to be able to go viral. And then one of the main things that we've been talking about in this webinar is that content is king, and you need to have that content and build it up over time to tell your story.
Anyone else want to chip on that before I ask a final question? No, right, okay. So this question is mostly in Daisy and Andrew. In terms of shaping your internal team, and how do you best go about that? Because obviously there's a huge amount of skill sets that go into creating a really successful social team, whether it's creative data, paid expertise. How much do you rely on internal versus external support in actually bringing this all together? I'll start with you, Andrew.
So it's an interesting one. And firstly, I am actively recruiting for a social media manager. So that's part of the answer to the question. So find me on LinkedIn if you want to apply, I'll tell you how. You have to have some resource internally to coordinate it all. There's no getting away from that. And I think, Jim, you summed up really well that there will need to be some mixture of creative and insight and data driven. I'm lucky because if I was to find a super creative social media manager, I've got a very data-driven CRM manager, assistant head of marketing as well, who can fill that gap, or vice versa. We can mix things around. I've used a combination in the past. Freelancers are amazing for producing content, delivering jobs quickly. Anyone else who works in the public sector here is kind of hit by this IR35 tax regulation that makes freelancers a bit trickier these days, but still useful. And I've relied on agencies as well. In fact, 3Pipe did some really great social work for us in 2016. So
award-winning.
You're right. Absolutely right. It was. And I think finally, it will all come down to what your finance director says you can spend your money on. Because at the moment, I've just done a restructure. Apart from this vacant social media manager role, I'm not going to easily be able to create more roles. I might more easily be able to use freelancers and agencies.
Good to hear that, Andrew. Daisy?
Yeah, I actually think it's a bit of a team effort. I draw on a bit of everything. I have used freelancers in the time I've been here. I actually really like growing relationships with agencies, good agencies, and I think sometimes that's a challenge. Some agencies have come and gone. And the thing about social is if you don't know much about it, it's very easy to get bamboozled with a lot of social chat and numbers and it's the jargon that can throw people. So I think it's being able to be savvy enough to choose the right team, but then also draw on the right agencies, because different agencies will give you different things ultimately. You can get dedicated agencies just on channels alone. So I think you have to look at the core. What is the core comms challenge first? What's the budget you've got to work with? Unfortunately, we all have to be realists. And I would like to grow my team. Absolutely, I would like more money. We don't have it for various reasons. So I have to work with the team I've got, and we are quite sort of channel agnostic. Couldn't get that word out. Channel agnostic, I suppose, in the sense that I have a number 2 in PR, but then I've got 2 people in the content team, and we help each other out. All our campaigns, all our work is both. It's not just one or the other. And we bring our agencies together as much as we can to co-collaborate as well. So yeah, you have to look at the core comms challenge and broaden it out from there.
Okay. Well, we've hit 1 o'clock, so I'm going to let everyone get some lunch. I just want to say thank you to our panelists, Daisy and Andrew, and to George and Daisy from 3Pipe. Thank you to everyone who logged in and watched the webinar today. We'll make the recording available after the event, probably sometime tomorrow. But thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.